Picture the ultimate classical hero. You know the one? Flowing hair, piercing eyes, golden armor, riding triumphantly across the entire known world. This is the Alexander the Great we all know, the textbook conqueror, the literal architect of empires. But there's another figure standing just out of focus in the shadows of history. A dark, imposing silhouette of an Indian king, King Porus, standing tall amidst the absolute chaos of battle, surrounded by towering war elephants and shrouded in a massive, glaring mystery. It's a clash of titans, right? But more importantly, it's a clash of narratives. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're acting as historical detectives. We're taking the universally accepted story of history's most famous general and we're putting it under a microscope. Have we been accepting a one-sided story for over 2 millennia? Have we actually been fooled by the ultimate historical con? Well, let's find out.
To understand a myth, you really have to look at how it begins. History has chosen to remember Alexander in a very specific, very deliberate way. Born from Zeus himself, a demigod in the flesh. Just think about the weight of those words for a second. We aren't just talking about a highly capable king here, or some brilliant battlefield tactician. No, the narrative that was intricately woven around Alexander elevates him completely out of the realm of ordinary humans. He was packaged, polished, and sold to history as a literal god walking among men. This is the textbook narrative that's been handed down from generation to generation, totally unblemished and unquestioned. It's a story so grandiose, so incredibly cinematic, that it almost feels too perfect to challenge. And honestly, for the longest time, almost nobody did.
And hey, the legendary resume practically builds itself. By the time he was a preteen, just 12 years old, he supposedly tamed this unbreakable wild stallion that fully grown, battle-hardened men were absolutely terrified to even approach. From there, he just seamlessly transitions into a military prodigy, marching north and decisively crushing the Thracians. As he grows, his life basically turns into an epic highlight reel, just a relentless, unbroken streak of military victory after military victory. When you wander through museums, filled with those marble busts and you stare at those massive sweeping empire maps stretching all the way from Greece to India, wow, it is incredibly easy to get swept up in the momentum of the myth. It paints a picture of a man who simply could not lose, an unstoppable, divine force of nature.
But despite being a literal demigod who conquered the known world, if you look at his social media presence today, well, he has exactly 0 Instagram followers. Okay, jokes aside. While he obviously didn't have a smartphone to document his conquests, this 0 actually represents something much more profound for our investigation today. It represents the absolute, chilling lack of direct, real-time, unfiltered access we have to the actual events of his life. We have all these grand tales, these epic battle reports, and sweeping narratives of his greatness. But when we strip away the millennia of storytelling, the marble statues and the dramatic paintings, we have to stop and ask ourselves a very serious question about the foundation of evidence we're actually standing on.
Which leads us to the ultimate question. How much about Alexander is actually true, and what is just brilliant fiction? I want you to slow down for a second and really think about this with me. When a story is repeated enough times, over hundreds and thousands of years, the line between historical fact and mythological propaganda becomes incredibly blurred. We're investigating a man whose very title includes the words, the Great. But greatness is subjective, right? And history is famously written by the victors. So if we actually pull back the curtain on this unstoppable conqueror, past the shiny armor and the accolades, what we really find.
Well, let's look at the timeline, because this is exactly where the standard narrative hits a massive roadblock. Alexander's life officially ends in 323 BC. Now, you would think, for a man who forever changed the geopolitical landscape of the ancient world, we'd have a mountain of primary sources. Eyewitness accounts, contemporary journals, official state records written while he was actually breathing. But as decades pass, there's a glaring silence. We have absolutely 0 surviving primary sources. None. The real shocker here is that the records we do have, the ones forming the entire basis of our modern understanding, were written centuries later. We're talking hundreds of years after the fact. Imagine trying to write a flawless biography of someone who lived in the 1600s, but you only have access to stories passed down via a multi-generational game of historical telephone. That is the precarious reality of Alexander's history.
Which brings us to a somewhat uncomfortable realization. Are we blindly following the West? This is a point heavily emphasized by historical researchers who finally dare to look outside the traditional European lens. Because those secondary sources, the ones written centuries later, they were overwhelmingly authored by Greek and Roman historians.
And let's be real, these writers had a massive vested cultural interest in painting Alexander as the ultimate, flawless hero of Western civilization. For centuries, modern historians and the general public have largely accepted this Western narrative without raising enough critical questions. We've essentially consumed the story exactly how they wanted us to consume it. But to really get to the truth, we need to look for the fractures in this pristine narrative.
And there is absolutely no better place to look for those fractures than the Indian campaign, Alexander versus King Porus. This is the absolute climax of his eastern expansion. Alexander's forces march deep into the Indian subcontinent, and suddenly they encounter an entirely different world. Torrential monsoon rains turning the earth to thick mud, sweltering heat, and a terrifying style of warfare they'd literally never faced before. Massive, armored war elephants that could just trample a phalanx to dust. The Battle of the Hydaspes River in 326 BC is traditionally recorded as one of Alexander's greatest masterpieces, a brilliant tactical victory against overwhelming odds. But remember our investigative mindset today. If our entire understanding of this epic, brutal showdown comes from sources that inherently favor Alexander, we really must ask what the other side of the battlefield was experiencing.
So, the accepted Western account paints this noble, tidy picture. It tells us Alexander was the unstoppable conqueror, that he brilliantly outmaneuvered and defeated King Porus, but then, out of sheer magnanimous respect for his bravery, allowed Porus to continue ruling his lands. Wow, it sounds like the perfect ending to a Hollywood movie, doesn't it? But dig a little deeper and you find a glaring missing record. There are virtually no ancient Indian primary sources corroborating this Greek account. No local inscriptions, no contemporary texts from the subcontinent confirming that this grand, sweeping defeat happened exactly as the Greeks claimed. As impartial observers, we have to weigh this silence. Does the absence of an Indian record mean the Greek story is unquestionable fact? Or does it suggest that the textbook story might just be heavily embellished, one-sided PR spin to cover up a campaign that was actually a grueling, bloody stalemate?
And to understand exactly why a PR spin might have been necessary, we have to look at the psychological cracks in Alexander's own leadership. Because by this point, he wasn't just fighting foreign kings, he was actually fracturing his own army from the inside. Look back at his earlier campaigns against the Persian Empire. Time and again, King Darius sued for peace. He offered massive concessions, unthinkable wealth, vast territories. And time and again, Alexander rejected it. He was relentless, driven by an almost manic obsession with total conquest. This refusal to stop drove a deep, devastating wedge between him and his native Macedonians. His own army, the men who bled for him across thousands of miles, grew exhausted. They didn't want to keep marching into the monsoon rains. They just wanted to go home. The supposedly divine demigod was, in reality, a deeply flawed mortal commander dealing with plummeting morale and internal mutiny.
So here's the puzzle. If he was a mortal man who drove his own army to the brink of mutiny, and if his final campaigns were far more ambiguous and bloody than history suggests, how did the myths survive so flawlessly? Well, the answer lies in the Hellenistic age. This is the era immediately following Alexander's death, where Greek culture, language, and influence spread massively across the known world he had touched. Honestly, you can think of the Hellenistic age as history's greatest, most effective public relations machine. Because Greek culture became dominant, the Greek version of Alexander's conquests became the dominant, surviving narrative. It was in their direct cultural interest to remember him not as a tyrant who fractured his army, but as the golden demigod who brought their civilization to the very edges of the earth.
When you put all these pieces together, you really start to see the brilliant anatomy of a historical con. How do you turn a flawed man into a flawless myth? First, you rely solely on secondary sources written by people who inherently idolize the subject. Second, you accept that Western narrative blindly, purposely ignoring the missing records and the silence from the people he actually fought. And finally, step 3, you simply repeat the story for centuries. You put it in textbooks, you carve it into statues, you paint it on ceilings, and eventually, the repetition literally becomes reality. Look, we aren't saying Alexander wasn't an incredibly impactful historical figure, but the evidence proves that the version of him we've been taught is heavily curated, carefully polished, and intentionally one-sided.
Now that you've seen the timeline, the missing records, and the powerful machinery of the Hellenistic PR campaign, I want to throw it right back to you. What do you think really happened at the Hydaspes River? Was it the glorious, lopsided victory the Greeks wrote about centuries later? Or did an exhausted, fractured Macedonian army finally meet an immovable object in King Porus? History isn't just about memorizing dates and accepting the words of the victor. It's about asking the right questions, embracing the silence, and refusing to accept a single narrative blindly. If this deep dive made you rethink what you know about the ancient world, make sure to subscribe and join us for our next explainer as we continue to uncover the truth hidden in the margins of history. Stay curious.